Good afternoon. It's Friday, the 16th of December, 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News, the last UK Column News of 2016. I'm delighted to say joining me today, I have Vanessa Beeley in Damascus, and I have Mark Anderson in Texas. So we've got a lot to get through, and we're going to get straight on with it. And we're going to begin with our favourite Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, who apparently has summoned the Russian and Iranian ambassadors to the Foreign Office in order to convey in person the government's profound concern over the situation in Aleppo. He said both Russia and Iran have failed to uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law, specifically by failing to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid to civilians during the months when eastern Aleppo was besieged. They deserve no credit for the fact that an evacuation appears to be underway today, having inflicted such suffering on the people of eastern Aleppo. Iran and Russia cannot expect praise for allowing some people to escape at the final hour. Both countries need to ensure the United Nations now oversees the evacuation process and that all civilians and non-combatants are properly protected. And he set out apparently the vital importance of protecting civilians. Vanessa, there's so much wrong with that statement. I don't really know where to begin, but I mean, the sheer hypocrisy over the protection of civilians is part of it, since they don't seem to be particularly concerned about protection of civilians in Mosul.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is an extraordinary statement, but not so extraordinary when we consider the fact that the British involvement in the regime change operation in Syria is collapsing under the weight of its own lies and hypocrisy. He's talking about concern over the situation in Aleppo. Well, I suggest that Boris Johnson goes to Aleppo and actually sees what's happening there. And actually, the story is, the true story, let's say, is the liberation of East Aleppo after 4 years of occupation by various militant factions led by terrorist faction Nusra Front and ISIS, which of course are funded by the US coalition, which includes the Gulf states, Turkey, the EU, and the UK. And what we've seen, or what I've certainly seen in my 3 days in East Aleppo, is literally I've been able to enter the areas of East Aleppo, the districts of East Aleppo, as they are being liberated. So literally hours within full liberation, evacuation of civilians, I've been able to go into those areas and speak with civilians. And the testimony that I'm receiving, absolutely universal testimony from all that I spoke to, from children, from women, from fathers, from elderly people, from disabled people, was basically sheer jubilation and celebration at their liberation by the Syrian Arab Army and the Syrian government. And what is very important to state here, I mean, Boris Johnson makes this point about Iran and Russia not allowing humanitarian aid in. Well, in fact, what he should be saying is that his militant factions, the UK-funded militant factions, have been taking humanitarian aid that is supplied by Iran, Syria, and Russia, and they've been stockpiling it. And they've been rationing food supplies to the civilian in all of the liberated districts in East Aleppo. We spoke to civilian after civilian who told us of starvation under the Nusra Front regime, rather than the Syrian regime, as our Western media are so happy to call them. We spoke to one mother, for example, who had 12 members of a family, and she said basically bread was rationed to 12 loaves every 3 days. Water supplies were cut off in many areas, so that this is the first time since the liberation, so the first time in 4 years that they're having fresh water delivered to them. In every area we went to, we watched humanitarian organizations, Syrian organizations and Russian organizations supplying food, water, hot drinks, particularly in Jibrin, which is the registration center. So all of the civilians leaving the eastern districts that have been liberated are coming to Jibrin to basically register. And we were told that 95,000 had officially registered with the Syrian officials that were running the center that was receiving them. Now, in this center, we also were able to enter, Russian field hospitals that had been set up to treat patients that were exiting from 4 years of incarceration under Nusra Front-led militants. And we were very privileged. In fact, I think we're about the only Western media allowed into these tents to film the Russian doctors treating patients. They told us that the majority of what they were treating were untreated broken bones, untreated wounds, either from bullets or from violence meted out against the civilians by the Nusra Front-led militants, malnutrition, renal failure, all symptoms of extended starvation or extended poor living conditions, poor drinking water. So, my challenge to Boris Johnson is, instead of blaming Iran and Russia, who have been doing their utmost to get humanitarian supplies into these areas and to liberate these areas, he should perhaps focus on what the UK can do now to supply food and aid to the people that they have effectively, by proxy, imprisoned, starved, and deprived of medical treatment for the last 4 years.
Well, let's look at a couple of happy faces then. Who were these children?
These children were in Hanano, which again, when we entered, it had been liberated, I think, 2 days previously. Now, the extraordinary thing is, slightly heartbreaking from my perspective, we actually went with a team of Western media here, including, I think, CNN were there. What I found particularly heartbreaking was how these civilians were coming on the streets to tell their story and thanking the media for being there, in their innocence that many of the media, the majority of the media that were walking down the streets, had actually effectively been responsible for the perpetuation of the violence inflicted upon them, the imprisonment inflicted upon them for the last 4 years. But many of the children, we were told by one humanitarian official there with the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, that day that we'd entered was the first day that he saw the children had their bellies full. In other words, they were not desperate for food. Heartbreaking scenes, but at the same time, jubilation from these children and from all the civilians that we met. We also bumped into one director of a school in the area who told us that within 24 hours they would be reopening the school to start education for the children again. The children had not received any education in the 4 years that Nusra Front and associates had occupied those areas. He took us for a tour around the school, showed that they'd cleaned out. It had been held as a Nusra Front weapons depot and training center and Sharia courtroom. Within 24, 48 hours of liberation, they had already cleared all the rooms, brought in as many books as they could find. And as I said, the next day, they were going to welcome children in to continue with their education. This particular photo was taken in Sheikh Said, which was another area that we were allowed to enter literally hours after its full liberation. We were allowed up onto the rooftops, and here is one Syrian Arab Army soldier proudly surveying the scene of the area that they had succeeded in liberating. When we were leaving, we were shown hell cannons that had been captured from, again, the Nusra Front-led militants and militia. We met one elderly lady who had managed to continue living there through the occupation, we filmed her. She was in floods of tears at relief at finally being liberated from the occupation by the extremists. And again, to counter these hideous and obscene stories that are being amplified by Western media of Syrian Arab Army executing civilians, rounding civilians up, imprisoning them, raping them. I would like to point out that this is probably the biggest low of the Western media obscenity in reporting on this war against Syria. The Syrian Arab Army are the Syrian people. Many of these soldiers that I photographed were actually returning to their hometowns in eastern Aleppo. They were returning to their homes. They were returning to their families and seeing their families for the first time in 4 years. Do we really believe that these soldiers are going to massacre their own civilians? I mean, it is grotesque. It's absolutely grotesque to make these sort of claims.
And if I understand, the BBC this morning were suggesting that the Syrian army and the Russians were tweeting out that they would be killing people as they leave eastern Aleppo, and this it's sheer
No,
desperation in a sense, isn't it?
yeah, it's hysteria. They're seeing their mountain of lies being eroded rapidly by the liberation of civilians in East Aleppo. And, to suggest that these civilians that are leaving, that in fact were fired upon by the terrorist factions. Again, we were given testimonies time and time again. One woman told us of terrorists firing upon civilians trying to leave via the Syrian state and Russian organized humanitarian corridors. She told me, and again, she was weeping on film. She said one woman that she knew who was starving went on her knees in front of the terrorists begging for food, and they shot her in the mouth in public. We were told of summary executions if anybody was suspected to be associated or supporting of the Syrian government. If children had older brothers or fathers in the Syrian Arab Army, they were executed also. We met with children who had basically been in hiding for the last 4 years and were finally able to come out, who told us of younger brothers or older brothers who'd been executed simply because their father had been fighting with the Syrian Arab Army.
So this gives us a clue of some of the devastation of the place.
That is in Sheikh Zayed, yeah.
And we have a hell cannon here.
Yeah, that was one of the captured hell cannon again in Sheikh Zayed, yes. And these are the cannons that were actually used to pound civilians in West Aleppo, because these cowards didn't use these weapons and missiles against the Syrian Arab Army, which is what one would expect in a civil war scenario, which is what is conveyed by Western media and governments. In fact, they used these hell cannon to pound civilians in West Aleppo and to eviscerate children, mutilate, massacre civilians in West Aleppo.
And again, here we sort of see people trying to get back to some sort of normality in the midst of horrendous destruction. Even children.
In fact, this kid on the skates, his name was Mohammed. We filmed him and we interviewed him. He actually was the surviving brother. His younger brothers and his older brother had been executed. We asked him how he had stayed safe for the 4 years, and he said he basically just stayed in hiding, and that's how he survived.
I mean, that's the feeling of freedom he has at this point must.
Yeah, I mean, this was an extraordinary moment to see him skating down the street with the scenes of complete devastation on either side of him. And what was amazing, people are accusing myself, Lizzie Phelan of RT, of forcing these people to talk. Nothing could be further from the truth. They were pouring onto the streets to tell us their stories, and were desperate to one, praise the Syrian army. Again, we saw scenes of Syrian Arab Army soldiers putting down the weapons to carry old ladies downstairs, to help elderly people in wheelchairs to get up the street to the humanitarian camps that had been set up to give them food and medical treatment. We spoke with one very elderly guy in a wheelchair in Jabrin who was waiting to be seen by the Russian doctors. He confirmed again all of the testimony that we'd received in other areas of terrorist atrocities against civilians. And he told us that since 2013, when the Aleppo doctors had been driven out of East Aleppo, he'd not received any medical treatment whatsoever. And another very important point to make, Mike, the White Helmets, who we've been investigating, as you know, for the last 18 months or so, everybody that we spoke to, including the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, had either never heard of them or described them as civil defense that worked only with the terrorists and never treated civilians. In fact, Lizzie Phelan interviewed 2 people in eastern Aleppo at the same time as I did. And one gentleman actually claimed that the White Helmets had deliberately killed his daughter, his child, when he took her to a White Helmet center. Another guy had testified that the White Helmets did not rescue people from rubble. They left them under the rubble to die. So the impression that we got very strongly from all civilians that we asked was that either they didn't even know who the White Helmets were, or that they were civil defense working only with terrorists, or that they deliberately were deliberately killing civilians in East Aleppo.
Now, look, before I show a couple more pictures, there's a question being asked in the chat box, or a point being made. It says, it makes you wonder where the mainstream journalists were while all this was going on. And of course, the truth is the mainstream journalists were nowhere to be seen in the area.
No, I mean, the BBC had actually been about 2 days before I got there. But I have no idea how they managed to distort the truth into their usual twisted narrative. And as far as I'm concerned, Lise Doucet is criminal in her reporting. She's now back in Beirut, and of course now her and Jeremy Bowen are producing, along with Channel 4, a sort of a circus of fakery that is quite incredible. I mean, one question I would ask these media moguls is how on earth are there so-called activists on the ground, whether it's the White Helmets, whether it's Wa'ad al-Khatib, whether it's Hamza Khatib, whether it's Bilal Abdul Karim, how are they broadcasting via Skype in an area where I had zero 3G, no Wi-Fi, where there was no electricity? And to be honest, Mike, we went to every liberated area. There was no sign of these people. I mean, so my suggestion is that they are broadcasting from either Idlib or Turkey. And what we're seeing now is complete exposure of the fraudulence of our media channels. And this will cause, a seismic paradigm shift away from what is the real fake news to what is the real news coming in from independent media.
Okay, well, I would imagine these are the first bananas these people have seen in quite some time. But the children continuing to play. And is the rebuilding beginning?
Oh, I mean, this was an extraordinary fact. I mean, in Hanana, for example, which is where this was actually right next to the school that is being reopened tomorrow. Volunteers from among the civilians, combined with the Syrian Arab Army and various other Syrian state organizations, were already cleaning up the whole area. Central reservations in the roads had already been replanted with trees and flowers and plants. The resilience of the Syrian people is quite extraordinary. This lady we spoke to, she had returned to her home after 4 years. She fled when the terrorists occupied East Aleppo. She fled to West Aleppo, and this was the first time she had been able to come back. This is the remains of her home. She came down and she spoke to us again. We filmed it, and she showed us that all she had was a bag of her belongings, a plastic bag, and her Quran. This again is in Hanano.
Okay, and people trying to get back to normal as quickly as possible. Tell us about this boy.
I mean, bless him. This actually, he hadn't been injured in the fighting. He'd actually fallen over in the street. But again, what was quite astounding was these children. We'd been told the day before, our taxi driver had actually just escaped from the old city. And he told us what he found incredible was how everybody looked like they'd been down a minefield. And this is exactly what it looked like. These filthy, sort of emaciated faces of the children that showed clear signs of malnutrition. This, Mike, is actually the old city. This is in the main square of the old city, which again, when we entered it, we tried to enter it on one day and we were spun very quickly because the fighting had kicked off again. And snipers were actually firing pretty much all around us. So we got out of there pretty quickly the first day. The second day, we were allowed back in, and we were allowed to walk the streets that the day before had been under sniper attack and terrorist attack. So we were literally in the front lines. Syrian Arab Army were fighting house to house with Nusra Front and Ara al-Sham in this particular area. This is one of the Syrian Arab Army female soldiers. She just exited from one of the houses where I assume they'd been fighting, and she was basically in her own world. She was surveying the devastation.
She looks. It's quite a haunted look.
Yeah, and not surprising, Mike. I mean, the old city, from a heritage and cultural point of view, is one of the most important cities in the Middle East. This is the courtyard of the Umayyad Mosque in the old city, which was taken over by Nusra Front and Ara al-Sham and used as a sniping center, actually. And in fact, I don't know if you have that photo, but we walked along the street towards the Umayyad Mosque. And as I said the day before, we would have most likely been sniped. We were actually told after our visit that there had been found 3 or 4 terrorists in the basement of the houses that we just walked past.
Sorry, Vanessa,
yeah.
the thing that strikes me about that picture is the number of bullet holes everywhere.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
you know, the amount of fighting that must have seen is incredible.
Absolutely. And another very strong point to make here, this is one of the most ancient Sunni Islam mosques, and yet it has been desecrated. Its 12th century, or I think even older, minaret had been detonated and brought to the ground. And as I said, you know, these Islamic extremists have destroyed a mosque, which is for them, should be for them, one of the holiest sites on the planet.
Is that
this
the
actually
same?
the collapsed minaret? Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and this is what we had to clamber over to get down into the courtyard, basically. And this is the courtyard itself.
Well, this one, just to end off with, showing an Al-Nusra flag.
Yeah. Exactly, and these were found everywhere in eastern Aleppo. Everywhere we went, you could see clearly that the militants and mercenaries that were there were working under the black flag of Nusra or of ISIS. There were also al-Sham flags, which obviously are the terrorist faction that the US refuses to designate a terrorist organization. And if we can just go to the video very quickly of the 2 boys, because I think this very clearly demonstrates the mood of the people in Hernano. I basically set up the camera to just keep filming while I was filming elsewhere. And almost immediately, these boys came and sat themselves down in front of the camera and sang or chanted the Allah, Surya, Bashar Bas, which is basically God, Syria, and Bashar is enough.
Allah, Surya, Bashar Bas. Thank you.
Yeah, the thing that struck me most was the thank you.
Yes, yeah.
I mean,
And you know, these kids were, it's very difficult, and it's actually still, in many ways, quite emotional for me, because to hear the horrific experiences that these people had gone through, and to see the sheer, I mean, so many of them described the last 4 years as hell, and escaping from that as heaven. And they used exactly those words. And that was in the same sentence as praising the Syrian Arab Army that Western media is trying to portray as raping, executing, and massacring their own people.
Mark, let me bring you in at this point. What do you make of what you've seen? This is obviously the first time you've seen all this stuff, and of course you're seeing all the media hype in the United States over this. So what do you think of what Vanessa's just shown?
Well, it's very moving for starters, and it's extremely informative when you compare it against the mainstream media narrative. And certainly it explains an item that's coming up shortly here on today's show about why Congress is now getting involved. It's not enough for the CNNs of the world and BBCs of the world to peddle their fakery. We also have to have the protection of the mainstream media, and that's where Congress is coming in to try and protect the geostrategic interests of the West, and in so doing, try and protect the media that's trying to keep the false narrative going.
Well, look, don't give too much away just yet. We'll come on to that in a second. Just before we do, I just want to bring in General Richards here. He was on BBC Radio 4 this morning. This is General David Julian Richards, and he's a retired senior Army officer, British Army officer. He was the Chief of the Defence Staff, and obviously that means he was the head of the British Armed Forces. He's a life peer, and he said, well, that the war in Syria is lost, but that doesn't mean we need to lose the peace. He said there's no clear strategy in the West, sadly. We're up against someone in Putin and Assad who have a very clear strategy, and they are outsmarting us at the moment. He said, I'm afraid we've lost the war, but that does not mean if we get the right strategy that we need to lose the peace. I think that's what Western politicians and statesmen must now focus on. We offered a credible military strategy that would have taken a year to execute. He was talking about basically taking out Assad back in 2012 and 2013. He said he had a credible military strategy. He said it was a good strategy. It was presented, but there was no appetite for it. That was a real shame. They missed their opportunity. And so they've got to try another strategy at the moment. And he said, we're all horrified about the humanitarian situation in Syria. If we do not bring this war to a close, and Vanessa, for me, what came across is it was very strongly his view of who is responsible for the war, who started it, and more importantly, who can stop it.
Absolutely. And I think here we just have a clear admission that this war is an external war, that it's a dirty war that's being waged on three fronts against Syria. One is the military proxy terrorist invasion. Two is the propaganda war being led by the NATO-aligned media, which, as you've mentioned, is now being protected by Congress and by the UK government and by various EU governments. And of course, the criminal economic terrorism of the US and EU sanctions against the Syrian people.
Yes. Okay. Well, look, Vanessa, stay with us if you can, because we're going to cover a couple of subjects and then we'll probably get back onto something that you can comment about. But let's just briefly talk about war on fake news. This is Town Hall website, War on Fake News, part of a war on free speech. Mark, and from your own website, fake news targeted. The Senate passes counter-propaganda bill as part of NDAA. And Mark, this is what you were hinting at a second ago. So fill us in with the details of this, because I haven't heard too much of this yet.
Well, starting with the first item that you showed, Mike, that's written by the former Congressman Ron Paul, who, of course, ran for president in 2008 and 2012. He's no longer in Congress, but as most of us know, his son ran as a Kentucky senator. At any rate, Ron Paul made the very salient point that for the mainstream media to call the so-called alternative media fake, to say that the alternative media peddles fake news, is in fact an attack on free speech. Because who's to say what's fake or what's not? Who's to define what news is and what news isn't? While the mainstream media seeks to define what news is, they don't just want to be dominant in their influence. They want to define the very meaning of news. And Ron Paul appropriately is shooting back, saying unavoidably, inevitably, that is at its very core an attack on free speech, because no one can arrogate themselves to say, we are the definers of news. We define what news is, therefore only we are believable. So that's Ron Paul's part in this. The other part is, as I alluded to a second ago, after watching Vanessa's very moving narrative and photos and videos, is that right on cue, and unsurprisingly, I suppose, it's not just that the dominant media wants to remain dominant while calling everybody else fake. They want, of course, protection. So along comes Rob Portman, an Ohio senator, and he's a Republican, and Chris Murphy, a Democrat, a senator from Connecticut. Murphy, often a speaker to the Atlantic Council and to other globalist groups. Well, they have co-sponsored this bipartisan betrayal, one might call it, and that's this blog item that you showed here, Mike. And to get into the meat of it just for a moment, the legislation that passed on the Senate side is S 3274, the Countering Disinformation and Propaganda Act of 2016, quote, ostensibly to help American allies counter foreign government propaganda from Russia, China, and other nations. Now, the House version to create this Ministry of Truth in the government is H.R. 5181. The House has not voted on this as the 114th Congress winds down, but the Senate on December 8th did pass this legislation. And what's interesting is, first we have to understand the essence of it, and briefly what that is they're trying to say that, like Russia today, being a state-funded media, at least nominally, is engaged in propaganda in favor of Russia. So they're saying that because Russia today gives a different narrative, let's say in Syria, And because media like, let's say UK Column and other alternative media might, in some cases, report things along the lines of Russia Today, then it's the old vintage guilt by association game. So any alternative media that report along the same lines as RT and report a different narrative on things like Syria and other important geostrategic matters, then they're all engaged in quote unquote pro-Russia propaganda. In other words, we're all in league with the Russian narrative. So they're trying to cast a very wide net to say that all alternative media are along the lines of RT. Therefore, most or all alternative media that are telling the truth are in league somehow, ideologically or otherwise, with Vladimir Putin. And this is literally what's being said here. Senator Murphy said that Congress has taken a big step in fighting back against fake news and propaganda from countries like Russia. And then he goes on to say, when the president signs this bill into law, we'll finally have a dedicated set of tools and resources to confront our adversaries' widespread efforts to spread false narratives that undermine democratic institutions and, get this, compromise America's foreign policy goals. So the real concern here, thinly veiled, is that these foreign policy goals are being undermined by RT and other alternative media. Hence, this legislation that the Senate approved and the House hasn't yet. And they want to create a global engagement center within the State Department to go after state actors like Russia, China, in addition to violent extremists, which aren't defined. And then this global engagement center will be led by the State Department, quote, with the active senior level participation of the Department of Defense, get that, US Aid, which is a known CIA front, by the way, the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which is an obscure body in the US government, the intelligence community in general, and other relevant agencies. And that's a quote according to Senator Portman from Ohio. And so they even want to establish a fund to, quote, help train local journalists and provide grants and contracts to think tanks, NGOs, media organizations, and other experts outside the US government with experience in analyzing the latest trends in foreign government disinformation techniques. So taken all together, Mike and Vanessa, this is what Congress is up to. It's not enough for the BBC and CNN to spread their lies. They want to protect those lies.
Well, just before I ask Vanessa for comment, Mark, you said that that's passed the Senate, but it hasn't yet passed the House of Representatives. So at what point is that likely to actually pass before Obama disappears as president?
Most likely. There is some resistance. This is out, getting out in American Free Press and other venues to try and generate calls to Congress. American listeners can call 202-225-3121 to reach the congressional switchboard if you're concerned about this. 202-225-3121 for the record. With the lame duck chicanery that usually goes on, that lame duck session after the elections, but before Trump is inaugurated and before the new Congress is seated, this is the typical kind of mischief that Congress passes as Christmas approaches, like they did the Federal Reserve Act a century ago on December 23rd, 1913, 2 days before Christmas. So this is the kind of mischief that Congress is notorious for in the lame duck session. The likelihood that it'll pass the House is reasonably high, but by no means assured. And I'll watch this very closely, and there'll be new postings on my blog, thetruthhound.com, and we can probably get things on the ukcolumn.org on your website between now and the end of the year to give updates.
Okay, so there's still an opportunity then to sort or at least stop it. But Vanessa, again, this is just another demonstration of well, I can't even think of the word at the moment, but they're clearly concerned about the narrative that they're presenting is not reaching home.
Well, I mean, this is extraordinary, isn't it? You know, honestly, what we're seeing at the moment is something it's historical. I mean, it was historical for me to be in Aleppo on the 12th of the 12th, 2016, which was the official day of liberation, and to see people celebrating in the streets and to feel this complete truth to power moment, the moment when the unity of the Syrian people, the strength of the Syrian and popularity of the Syrian government, the strength of the Syrian alliance with Russia and Iran had defeated United States hegemony combined with UK, EU, Gulf states, Turkey, all waging filthy war against Syria, and it was defeated. I mean, this has turned the world upside down. This is actually, I'm hoping this is bringing about the end of US unipolarity in the world. It's going to change the scene geopolitically. Russia has risen to really being a power, a global power in both diplomacy, politics, militarily, and is being perceived as, by those who are actually awake and aware of as a power that is combating US destructive and devastating hegemony that is decimated areas of the Middle East, and not only of the Middle East, worldwide. And when we hear that the media is going to be protected in order to fundamentally protect United States foreign policy, what more do we need to say? That clearly demonstrates that the mainstream media is nothing more than NATO choristers singing the hymns that NATO wants to hear and trying to nudge public perception to approve NATO state and Gulf state foreign military intervention into sovereign nations. I mean, it's extraordinary.
Okay, well, look, I just want to briefly bring in this man and this organization, not the organization that's on screen at the moment. The problem is that the organization that I want to discuss doesn't seem to have a presence publicly, although they have had over the years quite a bit of coverage in the mainstream media. And of course, one of the major parts of the fake news agenda is fake war crimes allegations. And that's what this man that I'm about to show you in a second is really all about. So, of course, at the end of it, we tend to kill foreign leaders that we don't like on the basis of so-called war crimes. But anyway, this organization that I want to mention is the Commission for International Justice and Accountability, the CIJA. As I say, they don't seem to have a website, so it's impossible to sort of see anything too much about them. But this was an event they were at a year ago at the Hague Institute for Global Justice. And the person that I particularly want to highlight is the guy on the right of the photograph. This is Dr. William Wiley, who's the Executive Director of the CIJA. So he is apparently investigating war crimes in Syria. He says that the UN say that war crimes have been committed, certainly by what he calls the Assad regime. He says that he is there to gather evidence and bring a case to the International Criminal Court. So the question is then, well, who does the work? And so he was giving an interview on the BBC last night, and I just want to run through a couple of the things that he said. So he said that they called it the Centre for International Justice and Accountability, but it's alternatively called the Commission for International Justice and Accountability. It's a private company. It's a non-profit foundation. It's funded by a number of countries, as well as by the European Union. Well, let's just look and see what the European Union does here, because this text a bit small down at the bottom, but as you can see here, here's a European Union document strengthening the analytical capability of the Commission for International Justice and Accountability, contributing to international security, and they got €1.5 million here. So if we just put him back on screen, he said that they are funded by a bunch of governments, including the EU, and one of the most important donors is the UK government. He said that they are funded to build case files for future prosecutions internationally. They're working with 12 governments to bring cases principally against the Syrian regime, officials who have made their way to the West already, mostly to continental Europe. Their principal focus is on the Assad regime, as they call it. They do look at certain opposition forces as well, one in particular, but he didn't want to say which one. He said that the United Nations is really a human rights business in the human rights business. He said that while they could be alleged to be stooges of the UK government, that they are looking at all belligerent parties, but actually they're really only looking at Assad. And they said that because of their relationship with some of the armed opposition actors, which are designed to ensure that they get sufficient evidence against the regime, most especially the high-level regime actors such as President Assad, that they do need to engage in partnerships with groups whose conduct sometimes leaves something to be desired. Right? So, that what they're saying is we operate with terrorists. We're quite open about operating with terrorists. The terrorists are getting us the evidence that we need, they say. So we'll talk about that in a second. He was asked about crime scenes. He said that they do look at crime scenes as part of their work, and that they have about 40 personnel on the payroll to look at crime scenes, again funded by the UK, that particular group. But 90% of their work is focused on extraction and analysis of documentation that they get in Syria and then move into Europe, hundreds of thousands of pages, and dealing with what he described as insider witnesses. He said that partnerships between their people in the field and certain armed opposition groups, opposition actors rather, are key. He said that they will overrun a regime facility with our people, so with his people, and his people will either be part of that operation or close to the operation. So that, in other words, he's admitting to operating directly with the terrorists. And then his personnel go and secure documents and start to process them and start them moving towards and ultimately over international borders. He described it, he said it's extremely dangerous work. He said one of the reasons that they work as a private company in the private model, he said this is the first time it's ever been tried. And he said that those involved in the organization have long careers with organizations such as the International Criminal Court. But one of the reasons the private model works is because they have a high risk tolerance, which enables them to get high evidentiary value material, is how he described it, which takes it to the top of the Syrian regime. Now, as for this man himself, he was the first ever investigator for the International Criminal Court. He worked in Yugoslavia, and he worked on the Rwanda tribunals. He was legal advisor to the tribunal that tried Saddam Hussein and other top Iraqi government people. Let's see, what has he done in the past? He was with the Iraqi High Tribunal, United Nations Assistance Mission for Iraq, Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Office, Department of Justice in Canada. He worked with Case Matrix capacity building in Iraq and the Balkans. And of course, he's ex-Canadian military. And he said that groups such as the CIJA, which he founded, could support these public institutions, and particularly in areas where they are necessarily going to be weak, particularly where there's a physical and a reputational risk. So in other words, the ICC may not want to deal directly with terrorists because there would be a reputational consequence for that. So he's prepared to go and do that work instead. So this is pretty impressive. Now, I've shown that one. He is the director of this organization, Samota, TSAMOTA Limited. It's a UK-based firm, UK-registered firm. He's the sole director. They say that they have project offices situated elsewhere in Europe and Asia, that they offer bespoke consultancy services built around the ethical provision of specialized advice in the undertaking of operational as well as strategic tasks in support of companies, government agencies, IGOs, NGOs, and individuals. Broadly speaking, they say Samota works in the fields of justice and security sector reform, principally in conflict and highly unstable security environments, for instance, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Vanessa, what do you make of this guy?
Well, I'd take the J out of the title, out of the CIJA as a start. I think, this is extraordinary. We've seen the EU potential, when they saw that Aleppo was about to fall, they started to offer financial incentives to the Syrian government to allow what they term the moderate rebels to set up statehoods within Syria. So still pushing their agenda to partition Syria along sectarian lines. That obviously has fallen by the wayside. Of course, the Syrian government was not going to accept something like that. And now, it's almost like we're seeing another form of infiltration, using the investigation of war crimes as a pretext to infiltrate Syria, to swarm into Syria with these terrorist factions that are suddenly going to become witnesses in the prosecution for war crimes against the Syrian government. I mean, again, it's grotesque beyond imagination. And you're quite right. This is obviously along the lines of the private security firms like Blackwater, like Constellis. This organization, the CIJ, is being used by the UN and other official governmental international community organizations as an outreach agent to carry out their dirty work and to disassociate them from criminal activity. I mean, it's extraordinary.
So this is what General Richards means by winning the peace?
Yeah, it looks that way, doesn't it? What it basically means is still achieving our geopolitical objectives in Syria, despite the fact that we've lost the war.
Yes. Okay, Mark, I want to bring this one up for comment from you, because we've spoken about this a couple of times this week. But as an American, what do you make of President Obama's threatened retaliation against Russia for hacking your election? I understand the Russians are about to hack the German election next year when Angela Merkel is going to lose the chancellorship. But and apparently the Russians also hacked the EU referendum in the UK as well, according to Ben Bradshaw MP. But Donald Trump then clearly only got the job because the Russians put him in it.
Yeah, this is getting rather tiresome, is my first statement. I've never said that Vladimir Putin is an angel. Probably no head of any modern state is. Russia has their intrigues and their corruptions, but I do not believe there's any evidence that's been put forth that's at all convincing that Russia did any actual hacking of U.S. elections. The irony is, though, and don't get me wrong, is you almost couldn't blame Putin if he did. If you were in his shoes, you'd be scared to death that Hillary Clinton could have become president. But I digress. I'm only making that point as sort of dramatic irony. At any rate, this is just more of the same to shift the blame for the loss of Hillary and the establishment of Donald Trump as president, to shift the blame to Russia and to then create this idea that Russia is such an untrustworthy player on the global scene. Well, how can we trust their involvement in Syria if, after all, they hacked our elections and they're also influencing media? Alternative media are in league with him. So, Russia is not just manipulating media and public opinion. They're also directly affecting our elections. So it's just a larger way, a more broad-based way of making Russia look like the main malefactor here. The fundamental point is that the West has such hubris. This idea that we always have the moral authority, this idea that we're always wearing the white hats in the West. There's just a total lack of objectivity on the part of Western media, the dominant media, and across the board. Not seeing that sometimes we have to look inward and see our own faults in the West and not always blame others. But besides that, the other point I want to make, and this is kind of important, is that if Russia is able to actually hack our elections, then that means the election machinery in America is hackable. And if the machinery is hackable, that means anyone could hack it. And that means, as I've said, these electronic voting machines that are made by companies like ES&S and Hart InterCivic, that means the electronic voting, the computerized voting in America is totally vulnerable to either outside or domestic hackers. Therefore, the government is indicting its own election system that it can be hacked in the first place. And so they've really got to backpedal a little bit about this wild narrative from Obama and realize what they're saying. Oh, you're saying our elections can be hacked? Well, the so-called alternative media, we've been saying that all along. That doesn't mean Vladimir Putin did it, but it does mean and they're admitting it, that our elections can be hacked. And that means from anywhere, from domestic sources as well. And we've known our elections can be stolen. I have lots of evidence that that's done at the local, state, and sometimes national level. And the government's indirectly vindicating that elections can be stolen, but wrongly blaming it on Russia as we see it.
Yeah. Right, we're rapidly running out of time. So, General James Mattis, you've got an article on American Free Press at the moment on this man. What's your view of it? I know you didn't write this one, but what's your view of it?
The main view, Mike, is that this is one that has to be watched a little more closely. This article posted now on AmericanFreePress.net. Readers and listeners can check it out on their own to get more details. But a lot of people,
And with that, we've lost Mark. So just while we try to get Mark back, Vanessa, I just want to end on this one because China now has done pretty much the same as China has done pretty much the same as what Russia has done, and they seem to be passing laws against foreign NGOs. So Vanessa, what do you make of this? Basically, the NGOs that are screaming about it, that are squealing about it, are of course the likes of Human Rights Watch and these types of NGOs that may have a vested interest in making some kind of change within a country from the inside.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think China is probably learning from Russia, who introduced kicking NGOs out of their country as foreign agents law fairly recently, and very wisely. We've seen the NPIC, the not-for-profit industrial complex, being used as a smart power tool, a soft power tool by imperialism for years now. And so if we're seeing China, who, by the way, is also in serious talks with, for example, the Syrian government regarding rebuilding projects in Aleppo, for example. So again, we're seeing China now getting involved as an economic trade partner in Syria, which is extremely positive for the Syrian government, because we know from history that China, when it invests to the mutual benefit of both countries with which it's trading. So I think it's very interesting at this stage in proceedings that we're seeing China clearly taking a stand against the Western NGO complex.
Yes. Well, Vanessa, just give us a bit more on how much, or what kind of scale China is getting involved in Syria already.
Well, we know, for instance, that I'm pretty sure I'm right in this, that China already have people helping from a technological perspective based in the coastal area where Russia has its naval base in Tartus. When I was in Damascus, when I just arrived in Damascus, the Chinese envoy gave a press conference the day after I arrived, in which he spoke about future partnerships, trade partnerships with Syria. So, as I said, we're seeing very much a geopolitical shift here towards a multipolar world, which can only be beneficial in seeing the end of US hegemony, which has existed really in realistic terms for decades now globally. And so I think we will see China coming more and more out of the shadows as a partner in the axis of resistance, let's say, which of course in Syria is Syria, Russia, Iran, and China, who up till now has maybe been the smaller player, but I think we're going to see them emerge as a trade partner for the future in Syria.
Yes, well, thank you very much. Now, Mark, sorry we did lose you there for a while. Just briefly, if you could, just tell us again what you were saying about General Mattis.
What I really meant, and I'll wrap it up really quickly, is that a lot of people are pretty favorable toward Donald Trump's nominees, but General Mattis is one that deserves a closer look. Listeners and viewers can go to AmericanFreePress.net and check out that article. He's involved with the Center for a New American Security, And Soros Open Society Institute is one of the central financiers of that organization. So that bears watching for General Mattis to be Secretary of Defense as one of the nominees of Donald Trump. But the other nominees, many analysts view a little more favorably. So people can read up on that. That's the main point to make.
Okay, brilliant, Mark. Thank you very much. And look, I just want to remind everybody that today is the last UK column news of the year. We'll be back on the 4th of January. I'd like to wish everybody a very Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. And I'd just like to say thank you to everybody that has given us support this year. We have really appreciated it. I think we're making progress at this end. We've got some fantastic commentators like Vanessa and Mark, Alex Thompson, David Scott, and so on. I just want to thank everybody that watches us day in, day out. We will see you on the 4th of January. So thank you very much, Vanessa and Mark, and have a great Christmas and see you in the new year. Bye-bye.